start saying three things. First, English is not my mother tongue, so please be patient. Second, I'm having a cough. It's not coronavirus, by the way. And third, the most important message that I want to give you is that we have years of experience dealing with oil in Ecuador. And oil, from an environmental perspective, doesn't need to be bad at all. I'm going to show some results, some impacts of the oil industry in Ecuador in the last years. Some are good and some are bad. So the message is, it's not a problem of having or not having oil. It's a problem of what to do with the oil. So this is Ecuador. What you see in the, let me see if I can, here is the Amazon region. And you can see that the whole Amazon region has these oil concessions. All these blocks are oil concessions in the entire Amazon region, with the exception of two areas. The Yasuni, the southern part of the Yasuni National Park, and this part in the Cuyabeno region, which are untangible sites, because in those places uncontacted people lives. Uncontacted, isolated indigenous peoples, and the constitution say that those peoples need to have a place for living. But in the whole Amazon region, you have oil exploitation. Here in the north is what had already been exploited. Here in the south is what is still waiting for exploitation. And here in the coast, you have the first oil activities started here. As far as 1878, the first concession was given to Shell, but only the operations started in 1917, and in the Amazon started in 1937. So we are talking about more than 50 years of exploitation. In the 70s and in the 80s, the boom of the oil occurred. Total exports grew from almost 190 million to 2.5 billion in 1981. So it was a massive entrance of money to the country. An increase of more than 13 times. Today the total export is 19 billion. Not only from oil, actually the percentage of oil in exports has decreased. But also the Ecuadorian external debt grew almost 22 times, from 260 million in 1971 to 5,800 million at the end of 81. So I am not an economist. But what I'm going to ask is why, if a massive entrance of money comes to Ecuador due to the oil, the external debt grew as much as this number? Probably the economists can answer that question. So there are some economic impacts. For sure, Ecuador has passed to be from a low-income country to a mid-income country, and that has lots of implications. But also, the foreign production and consumption patterns did not change. The process of accumulation tied to the exports of primary products was not altered, nor the structure of the property, which is characterized by high concentration levels both in agriculture and industrial sectors, as well as in the commercial and banking sector. So we are still having poverty, not as much as in the 80s or 70s, but we are still having 41% of population under poverty in the rural areas and 14% in the urban areas, and in the right you can see the extreme poverty. So even having oil and having passed from being a low-income country to a mid-income country, this situation is still happening. And 20% of the children in Ecuador suffer from malnutrition. That's the fact. That's the fact. So you cannot talk about environment if you don't know, if you don't put in the context of social and economic realities. So what happened in the environment? One of the most important tragedies of the oil industry in Ecuador was the Texaco Chevron activities in the Amazon. In 28 years, Texaco caused what some experts believe can be classified as the worst ecological disaster in oil-related history. What they did was to have these oil ponds without any control, without any environmental safeguard, and they contaminated the lives of 30,000 inhabitants in the Amazon region, most of them indigenous peoples. So there is now a suit against Chevron and Texaco from a local community. Unfortunately, the laws and all the things in international courts were not favorable for the local people, so we are still looking at what's going to happen with that legal process. So the deforestation was increased, but this is something that it's important to clarify. Deforestation is here in yellow. And you can see deforestation mostly in the coastal area of the Ecuador, because this is the traditional place for banana production, for cocoa production and coffee production. A little bit of livestock as well. So the massive deforestation occurred in the 60s, 70s, not because of the oil, but because of other crops. But in the Amazon, you can see here, in the northern part of the Amazon, the deforested area is due oil production. Not because oil caused deforestation, it's because oil caused the opening of roads, and roads means colonization, and colonization means new agricultural frontiers. So what has been the impacts, other environmental impacts of the oil industry? Burned gas in the lighters of oil wells, 30 million kilos of gas per day lost, and contributing to climate change. I'm gonna, in a minute, I'm gonna tell you the good things that are happening. But first, let's focus on this. 8 oil spills per month has been registered in Ecuador. That's very important because that affects waters and human health. You can see here a house and the oil spill just in the backyard. 1 million hectares deforested in the Amazon, roads open, impacts in indigenous cultures. There is the case of the Waorani indigenous groups that was the last in being contacted in the 50s, but the contact was through the oil companies. And now the Waorani people is one of the most critical condition due to alcoholism, prostitution, and other things related to that initial contact. A very shocking initial contact. And that's interesting, being the Amazon, the area of the country where the all the oil production happen now is the poorest. It still continues being the poorest region in the country. So I'm hearing that you are thinking, and I think it's wonderful to have a fund. We don't have that. We didn't have that. We didn't have an oversight committee. So at the beginning of the oil exploitation, everything was not so transparent. We didn't know about the contracts with oil companies. We didn't have information on what were the impacts of oil production. We didn't have information on how money was used. So for me, the possibility of having an oversight committee is really, really important. Okay, so the country started to think on how to solve some of the problems. And David just mentioned this initiative of keeping oil in the ground. We are going to have some meetings, round tables in the afternoon. So probably we will have some room for talking about this initiative that didn't work, but it was an important initiative during the past government. But what we need to discuss in the country right now, and you probably are in that process, is discussing what's the model of development that we want for our country. Is a model based in non-renewable resources, or is a model that uses non-renewable resources to go towards a post-oil economy? Because oil is going to finish sometime, someday. What's going to happen after that? We're trying to discuss that in Ecuador. Also, the energy matrix, we have subsidies for gasoline, for instance, and the government tried to eliminate the subsidies in October last year, and you remember what happened. It was an uprising. All the population were in the streets, violence, deaths, 14 people were killed, and so on. So the issue of thinking what to do with the energy matrix is also important. But the most important thing to me is to think about how you are planning, what's your plan for the land use. Why? Because I consider that it's important to extract the oil, but you need to know and to understand where is viable, where is possible, and where is not. For instance, are you going to allow to extract oil from protected areas, from national parks? We can do that, unfortunately, through some mechanisms. But for instance, are you going to exploit oil from water reserves? So that are the kind of questions that you need to answer. The implementation of good practices, that's a change in the oil exploitation in Ecuador. This is one of the ITT, precisely, the oil that wanted to be underground. But now, since the initiative was failed, the exploitation started. And you can see here, this is a field, an oil field without roads. Everything was built through helicopters. You have a bunch of, how you say, pozos petroleros, duels? Duels. The duels are just all together, and then the pipes goes 2-3 kilometers in all directions to avoid opening new deforestation fronts. They have a good management of water and waste disposal. So this is a new way of doing things well done. If you have the opportunity to do it from the beginning, that will be incredibly important. Of course, you have to have policies on mitigation, restoration and compensation. Mitigation, I mean, how to mitigate the impacts, and you have to have the money, the resources to do that. If it's not possible, how to restore what has been damaged, and if that is not possible, how to compensate what you damage in one site to conserve another place. And last but not least, we have this Sociobosque program. Sociobosque means something like forest partnership, which is a government policy to give a monetary incentive to those that owns forests to keep them alive. Sociobosque is now 1.6 million hectares in Ecuador. So people that owns forests receive some money per hectare of forests alive. And that's something that could be a good idea if you plan to have a fund similar to protect the forests. So if there's time this afternoon, I would love to tell you a little bit more in detail both the Yasuni ITT initiative and the Sociobosque initiative for your ideas and inputs. And that's it. again, the message is we are not against. There are some organizations that wants not to extract oil. Ecuador is a country that depends on oil. 40% of the economy depends on oil. You cannot talk about not extracting oil. The issue is how, where, and how to invest the resources that comes from this oil exploitation. So thank you very much. I am more than happy to respond to any question.